Okay, let's see. Just making sure my audio settings are appropriate. If my audio feed is too loud, just let me know in the comments or something. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you on this slightly drearier than usual Palm Sunday, such as it is. So, today, somewhat ironically, we are going to be talking about the Nativity. So I've entitled this episode 2, Christmas Time is Here. Of course, I'm very aware that this is in fact Palm Sunday, and here we are talking about Advent, but that's just the way it goes. It is sometimes appropriate to think, even as we are contemplating specifically Jesus' death and resurrection, it's perhaps also appropriate to think about the way in which his incarnation began. The incarnation is the thing that enables his death and resurrection, so this may be helpful to think about. Okay, without further ado, let's begin. I briefly just want to summarize some of the things that we talked about last time. We discussed mostly chapter 1, looking at the story of Zachariah and Elizabeth, the parents of John the Baptist, the one who would come in the power and spirit of Elijah to prepare the way for God's Messiah. And we talked about how in this first chapter, Luke is juxtaposing very ordinary, normal things with extraordinary events that are heralding the coming justice of God. And there's this kind of thick Old Testament atmosphere. This story is steeped in connections to God's activity in the Old Testament. And so we looked at Zechariah and Elizabeth, but also Mary, the mother of Jesus. So just to recap a little bit, at this point in the story, at the beginning of Luke chapter 2, John the Baptist has been born. But John has sort of left the stage, so to speak, to make room for the story of Jesus' birth. We get this statement at the very end of chapter 1 in verse 80, and John grew and became strong in spirit, and he was in the wilderness until the day of his public appearance to Israel. And this is something that I'm going to refer to as a development summary. Repeatedly throughout the Gospel of Luke, we're going to see these short sentences that sort of give us a summary of the progress of the coming salvation of God, that sort of compactly summarize development. So we'll see things like Jesus' fame spreading throughout the region, throughout Galilee. Later on in Acts even, you see these sort of short development summaries, lots of people being added to the number of the disciples. These are all kind of the same sort of statement. And so I'll refer to these as development summaries as we go forward. And there's going to be this development summary talking about John growing and becoming strong. There will also be a couple different development summaries that talk about Jesus' childhood. What I want to point out before we move on, though, is that it says John was in the wilderness until the day of his public appearance to Israel. We know that from Luke chapter 3, John really doesn't start kind of gaining notoriety until after he and Jesus are already adults. And so you get this kind of weird sense that we're sort of leaving John in the wilderness. His childhood is sort of fast forwarded through. We don't really get any description about what John's childhood or development was like apart from this statement, but he is very much sort of leaving the stage, going into the wilderness, so to speak, until we actually see he and Jesus meet for Jesus' baptism in Luke chapter 3. And so now that John's been born, the focus is going to shift onto Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. I'm trying to stay hydrated. One thing I noticed about doing a class in this way is that sounds burbly. Hang on. Is that any better? Can y'all hear me okay? If it's still sounding weird, say something in the comments. It sounds okay to me, but it's just me. Okay. Is it still sounding weird? No? Okay. I shall continue. What was I saying? One of the things about teaching in this format is that I'm talking constantly for the whole time. And so usually if I'm teaching in person, someone will ask a question and I'll get a slight respite. But since I'm talking the whole time, I have to stay hydrated. Anyways, so up until this point, we've had this sort of leapfrogging between John and Jesus. And so we had the announcement of John's birth to Zechariah in the temple. We had the announcement of Jesus' birth to Mary. And we had a prophetic word. Still having audio problems. Okay. Maybe I just need to turn it up. I thought I had sorted all that out last time. Maybe not. Does that sound any better? I want to make sure I fix it before I continue. Pulsing. Wonder why it is doing that. Okay, it could be a network issue. It could also be a cable. Okay. Something is that better? Sorry. I was afraid this would happen. Okay, I'm just gonna restart this. Hang on. I'll be right back. Okay. I'm gonna let this sit for a few seconds and just kind of make sure that it is working properly. Let's see. I want to make sure everything is good audio-wise before I keep going. I'm actually surprised this did not happen last time. Maybe I just need to be closer to the microphone. We're using the pinnacle of ministry technology here at Redeemer Presbyterian Church. If it is sounding better, let me know. We're on a few seconds delay here, so I'll wait till this kind of reaches you. Is that sounding better? Monitoring the comment box here. Still bubbly. Well, that is indeed strange. Let me see. Hang on. Okay. I've unplugged and replugged all of my cables. Hopefully this will be better. Yeah, it could just be an issue with the stream. Well, okay. Awesome. Thank goodness. All right. So, as I was saying, we had sort of this leapfrogging pattern with John and Jesus. And so here, now that John has been born, Zechariah issued that prophetic word that referenced not only John's future, but Jesus' future as well. So we are now expecting the birth of Jesus. So that's where we're going next. So let's begin here with the very beginning of Luke there. So Luke 2 verses 1 through 7. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. Now, one of the interesting things about talking about this passage is it is so familiar to us. This is the Luke's version of the Christmas story. And so, this is the famous passage that's quoted by Linus in A Charlie Brown Christmas. And so this is a story that we're all very familiar with. And so one of my goals today is to kind of maybe shake up our familiarity with this passage a little bit and draw our attention to some things that we may not have paid attention to previously because of our familiarity with this passage. One thing I want to point out here at the outset is the framing of this passage. So think about this. In a movie or a television show, at the beginning of an episode or something, there might be a little kind of tag at the bottom of the screen that tells you the place and time where the story is taking place. So, for example, if you're thinking of, or if you're watching a film and on the screen comes up London, 1940, your mind might go to World War II and the air bombing of London. Or if you see Washington, D.C., 1963, you might think of the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Movement. these sorts of things. Those sorts of framing devices that tell you the time and place where the action is happening are intended to bring to mind a certain social context. And much the same dynamic is happening here. We see that in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And so the Roman imperial authority is taking action. And this is something that one commentator, Scott Spencer, I think interestingly points out. This part of the story is framed in what he calls Roman imperial time. But the interesting thing is that the rest of the story, the 2 episodes that sort of follow the birth of Jesus, are framed in light of Jewish religious customs. So Mary and Joseph going to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem, for example. And so there's kind of a difference there. And so a story that begins with Caesar Augustus sort of exerting his imperial control over his empire, the story begins in that way, but it will continue according to God's authority and God's plan. Another interesting thing is that here Caesar Augustus is decreeing a census. This is actually something that is not allowed for Jewish kings to do. The Jewish law actually prohibits kings from taking a census of their people. In fact, when David actually does decree a census of Israel to count the people, to see how strong their army might be, God actually disciplines him for it. And so here we have the Roman authority doing something that a Davidic king should not do or would not do. So an interesting thing there. Caesar thinks that he rules the world, he decrees this census, but we're going to see Jesus perhaps being set up as kind of a counterpoint to this Roman authority. Okay, so the goal of this part of the story is to explain how Mary and Joseph get from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And so in verse 4, we read that Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. Now, some things to keep in mind here. Number 1, Roman censuses, as far as we know, were not conducted based on lineage. So a common explanation for what we read in Luke here is that, well, Joseph has to go to sort of the town of his family, his ancestral home, because that was how the Romans conducted censuses. It is not. We have no evidence historically that any Roman census was conducted that required people to visit some sort of ancestral or tribal town in order to be registered. So that's not really the reason why Joseph is returning to Bethlehem. It's not just because he's of the lineage of David. Census according to property, however, is a known custom. And so the point here is that Bethlehem is actually where Joseph is from. It's not just because he has Davidic ancestry. It's not just his ancestral town. But it's actually where his home is. It's where his family is. It's probably where he owns property. The Roman imperial authorities don't really care about Jewish tribal ancestry. What they care about is where people own property, because that is something that can be taxed. That's what they care about keeping track of in this census. And so Bethlehem was, I think, Joseph's actual hometown. So it's not just his ancestral town. And the reason why this makes a difference will become clear shortly. So the thing to keep in mind here is that he is of David's house, and he has family in Bethlehem. That is where he lives. That's his town. And so he goes there with Mary. So we read in verse 5 that Mary is his betrothed, and at this point, she is already pregnant with Jesus. And so some things need to be explained here. So they're betrothed, they're traveling together, they're cohabitating, apparently. Some knowledge about Jewish marital customs sort of helps us out here. And so typically, my understanding is that the way this would take place is that Jewish weddings were a little more complicated than our customs here in the United States or in sort of the modern era. There's kind of two phases to a Jewish wedding. Number one, there is the betrothal. So this involves celebration with the bride's family. And it appears that Mary is from Nazareth. That is where her family lives. That is where she is from. And so Mary and Joseph would have likely celebrated with her family, sort of phase one of the wedding in Nazareth. And then there would be what is called the home taking, where the husband would take his new bride back to his town, his family, and they would have another set of celebrations there. And here I'm really leaning on some research done by Stephen Carlson. He's got a really helpful article, his research later on. I'm going to make my face smaller so you can see that. But the point is that Bethlehem is where Mary and Joseph finalized their marriage by celebrating with Joseph's family in his hometown. So they have this two-phase wedding going from Nazareth with Mary's family to Bethlehem, where Joseph's family is. And so one primary motive for this movement from Nazareth to Bethlehem isn't necessarily the census, but it is the finalization of their marriage. There's another kind of aspect to how this story is usually understood, and that is that everyone is going to their ancestral town or the town where they have to register all at once. And that there's this specific window of time, a very small window where everyone has to be registered. And that's really not realistic. You know, you can't have this order from Rome that is somehow spread throughout the entire empire that everyone needs to go register during this very specific window of time. There's more likely a year-long period of registration. And so Mary and Joseph have to go to Bethlehem to finalize their marriage. While they're there, while they're celebrating with Joseph's family, they are able to fulfill their civic obligation and register for the census. And so this is kind of how things might have played out based on the description here in Luke, and also based on what we know historically about how Roman censuses worked. And so, now we get to verses 6 and 7. While they were there in Bethlehem, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. And I'm just reading the ESV translation here. And so after the final wedding celebrations have been completed, the baby is born in a normal sort of Judean home birth. So just to kind of recap what I've said so far. Mary and Joseph returned to Joseph's hometown after celebrating with her family in Nazareth. She is already pregnant. So sometime after the marital festivities, she gives birth to Jesus in a normal, everyday Judean home birth. Okay. So what about that last word in the ESV translation? There was no place for them in the what? In the inn. What is this inn? How are we to understand this? So the word that the ESV translates as inn is the Greek word kataliuma. And this really should be translated something more like accommodations or place to stay. So there was no room for them in their accommodations or their place to stay. A different word is used for a commercial inn elsewhere in Luke. So if you're familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan, for example, the man who finds the injured man, the Samaritan, he comes across this injured man, he takes him to an inn that is a commercial establishment where you pay to stay there, a hotel, and a different word is used to describe that place. Elsewhere in Luke, the word kataluma, which is, again, the word that's translated in here in Luke 2, that word is also used to describe the upper room where Jesus and his disciples ate the Last Supper. And so, really, we're not talking about a hotel. We are talking about accommodations, just the place where they were staying. And so, more than likely, what this is actually referring to is an attached marital chamber or small apartment that was built off of Joseph's family home. So his family lives in Bethlehem, and when Mary and Joseph come to finalize their wedding, Joseph's family builds a small room for them to stay in. They are now part of Joseph's family, and so they are going to live with family. I use the word patrilocal there, meaning place of the father. So a newlywed couple would go to live with the husband's family. And so this would be a very small sort of chamber or apartment. It's not big enough to accommodate the process of giving birth. Giving birth was a fairly involved thing, even quasi-dangerous, and so that would have involved lots of family members running back and forth, bringing things, bringing water, whatever the mother might have needed. And so that requires a fair amount of room, more room than would have been available in this marital apartments. And so the manger is used out of necessity. It's not that there's no room in the inn, and so they have to go to a stable. It's not inhospitality. I have there in parentheses my little joke, inhospitality. Get it? Haha. But Stephen Carlson puts it this way. He says Luke's point is not so much any inhospitality extended to Joseph and Mary, but rather that their place to stay was too small to accommodate even a newborn. And here, just in the way of a visual aid, this is an illustration of what just kind of a normal first century house in Judea might have looked like. So let me see, I can grab my laser pointer here. So here upstairs you have sort of the main living area of the house. They might have built a small chamber or apartment, maybe on the roof or off of the side of the house for Mary and Joseph to stay in. These walls are made of mud brick, and so it's kind of easy to expand or add on to a house, given enough room there in the city of Bethlehem. And down in the bottom of the house, you have what is essentially a first century Judean garage. Down here you have perhaps a kitchen, a place for storage, but also where any animals are kept, chickens or goats or what have you. And so there's no room in the small apartment. They need more space than is available in sort of the main kind of family room of the house. And so Mary gives birth in what is essentially the garage. And conveniently, a manger is there. That is what they use to sort of temporarily house Jesus in. So this is a plausible description of what might be taking place here. But hang on a second. There's no place for them in the... Okay. This kind of challenges some things about the way that the Christmas story is usually told. Well, what about the innkeeper? There is no mention of the innkeeper. Who is that? You know, the innkeeper is sometimes included as a character in illustrations or perhaps film versions of this story. What about the stable? Well, the text doesn't mention a stable. That is an assumption that is made based on the mention of the manger. What about the wise men? Well, that's in Matthew. That doesn't happen until they return to Nazareth later in Jesus' life. And so we have here kind of conflicting versions of this story. Whoops. Is this the real Luke? Is this in fantasy? Of course, my humorous reference to Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. You know, what are we to do? There's another version of this story that involves Mary and Joseph rushing into Bethlehem frantically to register for this census. The town is crowded because everyone who has Davidic ancestry is coming back to Bethlehem to register. The town is crowded. There are no vacancies anywhere in any hotels or inns. They have no place to stay. And so you get this image of Mary and Joseph rushing from house to house, inn to inn, perhaps, just looking for somewhere, anywhere for Mary to give birth. She is sort of on the verge of giving birth at that moment. And so eventually they sort of settle on this stable outside of an inn, and the manger is there, and that is sort of how Jesus' birth happens, according to this understanding of the story. But as I hope you can see, there are a lot of assumptions being made in that version based on actually a very short passage. And so we kind of end up with two different versions of the story. The version with the inn and the stable has this frantic journey. Also the theme of rejection, homeless in a way. You also have this idea of Jesus being born in a stable, being born in a barn, and so the theme of humility is sometimes drawn from the story. But as I hope you can see, what I think is the more accurate rendering of this story kind of leaves us with a different impression. So the idea that Jesus actually had a home birth, a normal, everyday home birth, brings some different things to light. So you have God's plan unfolding through these kind of everyday circumstances, a normal Judean wedding, a normal Judean house. You also have the birth of Jesus happening among family. So kind of just like every other human is born among family and has, you know, family members around them. The humanity of Jesus is emphasized, but also simple ordinariness. Jesus' birth, if it is in fact a home birth, is extremely ordinary. Barring the idea that Jesus is born very early in Mary and Joseph's marriage, which has just taken place. That's a little weird. But outside of that, Jesus' birth is even more ordinary than John's. John was born to elderly parents, and there were these kind of miraculous circumstances of Zechariah's muteness and all of these things surrounding his birth. Jesus' birth is painfully ordinary. And so what I actually think that we see in Luke is that the Nativity is a painfully ordinary home birth of, I would say, the most extraordinary Israelite. So once again, this idea that Luke is juxtaposing extremely ordinary things with extremely extraordinary things. You kind of have this this juxtaposition of the ordinary and the extraordinary. And so, all that to say, this leaves us with a very different impression of what is happening in the birth of Jesus. Now, these very ordinary events are about to be followed by something that is truly extraordinary. And that is the appearance of the angels to the shepherds. But we will get to that in just a second. Okay. So, what about those shepherds? Let's have a look at them. So, just making sure there are no questions over there. Okay. The shepherds. While by their sheep they watched at night. Verses 8 through 12. And in the same region there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. And the angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger." So, Jesus has been born, and the birth of Jesus actually takes up very little space in the text. Those first 7 verses, really only 1 or 2 of which are devoted to Jesus' actual birth, and the verse that does actually mention his birth specifically mentions the swaddling cloths and the manger. So here we're being pointed back to that description. It is interesting that these angels appear to shepherds. Now, one thing that I have consistently heard over the years is that the shepherds are unexpected recipients of this news. I don't know if I quite agree with that. Sometimes the shepherds are described as being kind of lowly people. They're kind of the outcasts of society. They're sort of these rough guys out in the field, kind of on the level, societally speaking, of thieves or bandits. They're kind of not viewed very highly in ancient Israel. I don't actually know that is quite what's going on here. Sometimes I think that description is used to kind of say, well, the shepherds are these unworthy recipients, and so in the same way we are sort of unworthy of receiving Christ, and yet here the good news is given even to these unworthy, unexpected recipients. There's also a Roman tradition of associating shepherds in the field with sort of the dawn of a golden age that appears in a couple different places in Roman literature. But I think actually it is expected that these shepherds receive this news, because think about where we are: Bethlehem, the city of David, the shepherd king. And so it is perhaps appropriate that these shepherds receive this news from the angels about the birth of David's son, the heir to David's throne. Shepherds are the ones who receive this news. And so that actually kind of makes sense. The shepherds are worthy recipients of this news. And in fact, the idea that it is they who come to greet Jesus, the first of the sort of Israelite subjects to come and greet Jesus, their newborn king, the fact that they're shepherds, that's pretty appropriate, and that speaks to what sort of king Jesus will be, a king that imitates David at his best, a king after God's own heart. And so the fact that the shepherds received this news, that actually is pretty in line with what we might expect. But I want to make sure we have a good idea of this scene here. So the shepherds, they have this angel appear to them, The glory of God shines around them. They're filled with fear. And as I've mentioned, I think last time, the idea that the angel brings to them news, they're filled with fear, that kind of has some prophetic elements to it. But I want to think about what this scene would have looked like. Verses 13 and 14 say, "And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased." Okay. So, what would this actually look like? What picture is being painted in our mind's eye when we think about the angels, this multitude of the heavenly host appearing before these shepherds? Here's some examples. I'm going to show you a few different depictions of what this scene would have looked like. This is, I believe, taken from, I think it's a painting, but this is a Mormon illustration of what this would have looked like. And you can kind of tell because a lot of Mormon religious illustrations kind of have a similar look. You sort of have the very sort of white American looking angel appearing before the shepherds, and they're sort of cowering in surprise. I've seen lots of illustrations like this before. I'm not sure that angels look like sort of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Americans, but take it for what it is. I'm not sure this is quite what it would have looked like. Here's another one that I actually kind of like. I meant to look up the name of this artist, and I forgot. But this is another painting, and it sort of shows the heavenly host here portrayed almost like stars in the sky, sort of filling the entire sky above them. There you see kind of the star. I'm assuming this is the star over Bethlehem over here, and that's where the shepherds will go to see the Christ. And the shepherds here are sort of gazing up in awe and wonder at the angels. But I'm not sure this quite captures what the text describes either. Here is an illustration by Gustave Doré. I believe this is of a scene in Paradise Lost, kind of these winged angelic warriors. After all, this is a multitude of the heavenly host, God's army, and so it kind of makes sense that they might be armed. I believe this is, in this scene, this is Saint Michael and his angels doing battle with the forces of Satan. So maybe the angels look more like this? Here is an illustration that I think more accurately captures what this might have looked like. This is I believe, a 16th century Russian Orthodox icon, and it depicts Saint Michael here. Saint Michael, the leader of God's army, leading into battle the forces of Ivan the Terrible. So here his army is arrayed on these hills. So why might this be an accurate portrayal of what's going on here? Well, if you think of what... I'm going to go back here. If you think of what the text is actually describing, it says, "And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host." So first of all, they're with the angel. And really, all it says is that an angel of the Lord appears to them. It doesn't say he was flying. It doesn't really describe the angel at all. But the glory of God is shining around them, but the angel just kind of appears to them. I think it's possible that the angel is just standing there with them. I don't think it's necessary to read this as saying that the angel is floating or levitating. Um, and it says that there was with the angel, suddenly, a multitude of the heavenly host. And so the heavenly host, this army, the heavenly host is God's army, is just with the angel. So if the angel is sort of standing there before the shepherds, and suddenly there appears with him this army of angels, perhaps they are simply standing behind him. That is, this is more of an army arrayed in formation on the hills outside Bethlehem, and less of a choir that is floating or flying, anything like that. And so that's very different from something like "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." We commonly think of this as being sort of a choir of angels that have wings, and they're sort of flying in midair, singing and playing instruments. I'm not sure that's what's going on. And keep in mind, descriptions of angels elsewhere in the Bible are kind of terrifying. In Revelation, all of the wings and the eyes, and they're on fire, and all of these things. Some of the descriptions from, I believe Ezekiel has some descriptions of angels that sound downright scary. And so the idea that whatever they looked like, this multitude of God's army appears suddenly before the shepherds, that would be frightening. And also, it doesn't mention that the angels are singing. It says that they are praising God and saying. In Revelation, we have descriptions of angelic beings praising God. It doesn't say that they're singing necessarily. They are saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." Things like that. So I'm not sure that this is a choir. Even a military choir. This is something different. I am going to show you, or I'm going to try to show you, if I can get my audio to work here, a video that I think captures the force of what this would have felt like. If you're familiar with kind of rugby culture at all, you may be familiar with the New Zealand All Blacks, and they have a tradition of performing a Maori war dance, essentially, called the haka, before each match. And I want to see if I can play you this video. The audio might... We'll see how it goes. If the audio is kind of wonky, don't worry about it. But I think... I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that the angels were doing the haka dance. I'm not saying that, but I think this kind of captures some of the feeling of the scene. So hang on.
This is the Kamate version.
Act 1 in the books here tonight.
Okay. So, I always enjoy playing that video. Just the sheer intimidation of the Haka. You saw the guys on the other team have to just stand there and watch awkwardly as these, buff rugby players are, slapping their forearms and their thighs and sort of aggressively, almost preemptively declaring victory. This is meant to intimidate, and it's also used as a sign of respect as well in other contexts. But here's what I want you to notice, and I think the Haka kind of captures the rhetorical impact of this scene. The sense here is of a victorious army performing a war chant. So this is not a choir that is here to sing a nice song about how little baby Jesus is now here. This is actually a division of God's army that is declaring God's victory because of the birth of the promised king. Okay? So, a really helpful kind of co-text or another part of scripture that we can set alongside this to kind of get a sense of what's happening here is Revelation 12. And I'm not going to read all of this for you, but just to kind of point out a few things, Revelation 12 is essentially an allegorical reframing or retelling of the nativity story. You have this woman, a woman clothed with the sun, crowned with 12 stars, representing Lady Israel. And she gives birth to this child who is to rule the nations with a rod of iron, referencing their Psalm 2, the Messianic king ruling the nations with a rod of iron. But the red dragon is poised to devour the child as it is being born. God protects the woman and the child by carrying them away to the wilderness. But then, even in the midst of this, you have Michael and his angels doing battle with the forces of the dragon, which is, of course, that great serpent, Satan, the enemy of God's people. And so you have this kind of theme of angelic war in the midst of this retelling, this allegory of the story of the birth of the king. And so, all that to say, this is very different from how we typically understand this story. An ordinary birth is accompanied by extremely extraordinary events. An angel army has come to declare peace because of what God is doing in the birth of the Messiah. Peace on earth and goodwill to men. So, let's see how we're doing on time. Okay. So what happens next? Mary and Joseph are normal, faithful Israelites. This is one of those times where I'm not going to go verse by verse through every little thing that happens, but they do the normal thing, and they take their firstborn son to be consecrated to the Lord, set apart for the Lord. And the interesting thing that I want to draw your attention to is the character of Simeon. So Simeon is this old man, and when Mary and Joseph take Jesus to be consecrated at the temple, he is there. Simeon is there. Revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. And so Simeon here is kind of a symbol of old faithful Israel. Israel that has been waiting and longing for the Messiah to appear. He's been waiting in the temple for this event to occur, and now it has happened. And so Simeon sings this prophetic song. We use it at different times during the liturgical year as our kind of final song before we depart the worship service. Simeon says, "Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for the glory of your people Israel." This is a very Isaiah-ish set of words here. Isaiah, talking about the light of salvation dawning. But here, Simeon kind of cranks it up to 11. Not only is this light for Israel, but it is a light of revelation to the Gentiles. Isaiah talks about someday Israel ruling the Gentiles, but here Simeon's words kind of imply that not only will Israel's king rule the nations, but the Gentiles will be given this light of revelation. But not only do we see Simeon, an old man, but also Anna, a prophetess, a widow, an old woman. So here, Simeon and Anna kind of almost symbolizing, kind of Abraham and Sarah almost, waiting for the consolation of Israel. And she begins to give thanks to God. She begins to speak about Jesus to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. And so these two figures kind of represent old faithful Israel that is about to pass away. Anna and Simeon are very old. They are sort of on the verge of death. They represent this generation that was looking for the Messiah that is now passing away. And so when we see Jesus later on in Luke critique and criticize this present evil generation, this wicked generation, we get the sense that something has changed. Whereas generations of the past were looking for the consolation of Israel faithfully, something is different about this generation, apparently. The Abrahams and Sarahs are not here. They are gone. And so true faithfulness becomes the exception in this present new generation rather than the rule. And at the end here, we get in verse 40 another development summary. So I mentioned that at the beginning of our time together. The child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom. So kind of like John the Baptist grew and became strong in spirit, here we get grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. So a little bit intensified compared with John, but that is perhaps expected. Jesus is God's son. And we're now fast forwarding to another temple trip. This is temple trip 2. And so I mentioned before, whereas the beginning of this story in Luke 2 is framed in terms of Roman imperial power, both the trip to the temple to consecrate Jesus and then this trip to celebrate Passover, those are instigated by faithfulness to Jewish customs. And so, once again, Mary and Joseph are normal, faithful parents. They consecrated their firstborn as an infant, and now, fast forward 12 years, Jesus is 12 years old, they're taking him to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. This is fantastic Israelite parenting. And so they're in Jerusalem for the festival, and at one point, Jesus disappears. His parents are searching for him. They almost leave town without him. And after 3 days, they find him in the temple. And again, I'm kind of moving over a little bit of the text here. But after 3 days, they find him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. This is interesting because sitting in that social context was a symbol of authority and teaching. In our modern context, it's basically reversed. So somebody who is teaching is standing in front of a seated audience. So that's how we do sermons. That's how we do lectures or speeches. The one who is in authority, the one who is teaching or speaking, is standing in front of a seated audience. However, in the Jewish context here, it is basically the opposite. So Jesus is sitting among the teachers. So he is not standing in the posture of a learner, but he is sitting with the posture of a teacher. And so we see here that the teachers in the temple see Jesus as somewhat of a peer. They're amazed by his questions. There's something unique about Jesus. And when Mary and Joseph ask him, why did you do this? What are you doing? Jesus answered, did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house, going about my Father's business? And so Jesus is emphasizing his divine origin. Yes, Mary and Joseph are his parents. Yes, they are doing all of the things that good Jewish parents should do, but there is something that is not normal about Jesus. And so once again, the ordinary and the extraordinary. And so once again, we get a development summary in verse 40 here. Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. I think that's actually a typo. I think it's actually later in the chapter. But Jesus is still growing. As he's growing physically, he is also growing in terms of his reputation in favor with God and man. I kind of liken this to this scene in one of the Superman movies. I forget which one. There you have Martha and Clark Kent sort of being amazed at baby Superman lifting this car. And that's kind of the moment when they realize, yeah, I guess the baby that we pulled out of the spaceship really isn't normal after all. And this is kind of a moment where Joseph and Mary are coming to terms with the fact that, okay, yes, there is something that is truly different about Jesus, and they will have to come to terms with this. And so we might ask at this point, we've spent a decent amount of time on Jesus and what's been happening with him. We had his birth, we had his consecration in the temple. We fast forwarded 12 years to the scene with him in the temple with the teachers. But what about John? Where is John the Baptist? What is he doing? The last we heard from him at the end of chapter 1, he was out in the wilderness, supposedly until the time of his public appearance to Israel. And so that is where we're going next, because the path forward for Jesus lies with his cousin John. And so next time we're going to look at Jesus's baptism, the moment when Jesus receives the Holy Spirit at the Jordan River. And we're also going to look at Jesus's temptation in the wilderness, and look at how Jesus fulfills being the new Israel and what that means. So that is where I'm going to stop for today. If there are any questions at the moment, you can type those in the chat box, or send them to me if you think of something after the fact. I'd be happy to address those next time. I'm going to leave the stream going for a minute or two just to kind of make sure there are no questions. But having said all that, I will see y'all next Sunday, 3 p.m. We'll be looking at Luke 3 and 4. Thanks, y'all. And sorry about the audio issues. I think hopefully they will be not a problem next time. Like I said, the pinnacle of ministry technology here.